So in this video, we'll be taking a deep dive look into Naoto within Japanese context, especially in regards to the sociocultural understanding of gender norms as well as queer issues, from historical times past all the way to 21st century Japan. Hey guys, I'm Lady V, and as someone of Japanese heritage, I find much purpose and enjoyment in breaking down the cultural influences of the modern Persona games. I also hope that these can foster more empathy and understanding, so be sure to check out all my other analyses. But before we really get into it, here's a heads up about the structure of this video. So, although there will be multiple chapters timestamped, overall I'd like this analysis to feel like the kanji one, meaning this will be split into two main sections: the commentary on societal expectations for women's behavior and capabilities first, and the handling of gender identity second. Also, in the first part of this upcoming section, I will be using he, him pronouns just because it makes more sense when setting the stage and talking about Naoto's early appearances in the story. You'll see what I mean. But with all that covered, let's finally dive right in. If there's one thing that describes Naoto across the vast number of interactions prior to his actual dungeon, it's that he's always in a serious mood. There's no time for joking around or having fun, he's only focused on getting to the bottom of the case. It begins with Kanji, who unfortunately mistakes the desire to meet as interest when for Naoto, it's simply about acquiring more information on the case, though it's not until summer that we hear from him again. Naoto catches us on the way out from the tofu shop, and Rize confirms that he kept stopping by several times to ask questions. It's implied throughout the game, but especially in this arc, that the Inaba police don't always step up to the plate, with Adachi being the prime example of this. All the while, Naoto is consistently putting major effort into gathering and studying the relevant information, yet he is the one who gets flack for it from the higher-ups. Then in July, he subtly accuses the entire party of treating something this serious, where people have died and all, as just a game. Now, to be fair, Naoto doesn't have the entire context on the investigation team, so for all he knows, they're just a bunch of rumor-mongering kids who view the ongoing case as pure entertainment. And we start getting some major insight into his character when he goes out of his way to transfer to Yasogami High, even though he's already been taken off the case by the Inaba police. He refuses to give up on it. So yes, solving this case is clearly more than just some game to him as well. In fact, he wastes no time showcasing how serious he is about it all when he immediately shuts down these girls' attempts to hang out with him. He shuts down the party's offer as well, as he has things to mull over. And reading between the lines, it's obviously about the case. It's very telling that the only time he does hang out with all of us is during the school trip, since it's the only time he doesn't have an excuse that he has somewhere else to be. But even then, his agreement to hang out is a calculated one, since he uses the opportunity presented to ask a very serious question. What exactly is our involvement with the case? Aside from this, he just spends the entire King's game silently observing everyone, so what I'm getting at here with this long refresher is that he's always all diligence, no fun or games. Even the next day at Hagakure Ramen, he's just silently eating the whole time and only speaks up to remind everyone that it's almost time to head back. the kind of responsible behavior that's expected of adults in the workforce, which absolutely plays into how desperately Naoto wants to be acknowledged and respected in her discipline. The reality is, Naoto's dedication to her craft drives her to tirelessly pursue the truth of the case, to not simply give in to tunnel vision, or, in other words, the Mitsuo Kubo red herring. In the lead up to her dungeon, her former colleagues confirmed she'd often stay late looking through the files, but all this effort is just seen as a nuisance by the adult men of the Inaba brass. More work for the department when all they want is to simply close the case. They clearly don't take her deductions seriously. I mean, surely she must have pointed out that Mitsuo Kubo's MO is inconsistent with the other deaths. She's already solved a whopping 24 cases before ever taking on this one, and yet she's still treated like a child. And yeah, we can talk about how obviously unrealistic it is to have a teenage ace detective all we want, but not gonna lie, the fact Naoto is still a child is actual metaphorical genius, since it's not uncommon for women to be infantilized anyway. More on that soon. But first, let's return to Club Escapade and Naoto's response to the whole ridiculous persona thing.
Are you making fun of me?
Imagine how triggering this must be in hindsight, knowing all the stuff she's been dealing with. Not being taken seriously the entire time she's been on this case. I mean, just recall Dojima back in June, coming home piss drunk and annoyed that this kid was acting so grown up and polite. So, if her age is already going to disqualify her in the eyes of her colleagues, then she certainly can't have her gender fuel even more prejudice. This brings us to actual real-life Japan, where the national average of women in law enforcement was less than 7% back in 2012, guys. I did a ton of digging and could only find numbers going back to that year at earliest, but given how the average only increased year by year from 2012 to 2021, it's more than likely that this percentage was, at best, the same, if not lower, back around the time of Persona 4's initial release in 2008. This is a huge contrast, by the way, to other industrialized nations at the time. Many European countries already had way above this percentage. The UK's law enforcement was 23.3% female by 2007, Germany's was over 25% by 2008, though interestingly enough, something that didn't really surprise me is how the US already had more than Japan's 7% nearly an entire decade earlier, with an 11.2% all the way back in 2001, and yet over 10 years later, that proportion hadn't even increased a single percentage point. So in general, regarding the struggles women face in the workplace, Naoto outright states that the police are a male-oriented society. If they had the slightest concrete reason to look down on me, no one would need me anymore. And this includes proving to ourselves even that, yeah, we've done the work and deserve to be here. Like, self-doubt and imposter syndrome is pretty common, even if based on results, we've already proven we're some of the most capable workers in the room. So, as we know, the merits of Naoto's past performances and deductions obviously mean little to the Inaba police. And that brings me to this very relevant concept known as the likability trap in politics, where female candidates running for office are held to an essentially damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. A 2010 US study, and as always, links to it and all the other studies/journals in the description. This study examined pre- and post-election approval ratings of candidates and found that likability was the single most important factor for women candidates. In other words, they were still expected to fit into their socially prescribed gender norms. Be warm, caring, and friendly, something that doesn't come naturally to Naoto, more on that soon. But in contrast, the men running for office would receive votes even if voters didn't personally like the candidate. In general, women who are too strong or assertive are often dismissed as bossy, but on the other hand, if she acts the way society expects her to, then her warmth and friendliness is often thought of as too soft for these male-dominated disciplines. So there you have it, the likability trap. On that note, a 2024 report published by the IMF found that Japan still has significantly less women in any kind of managerial role in the workplace compared to other OECD nations. One of the main reasons cited are the prevailing gendered expectations, including the belief that women are supposed to provide the household labor, so like cleaning, child rearing, and so on. And I'll share more actual data on this topic a little later, but to return to the likability trap thing, this relates to this concept that I only briefly touched on in the kanji video, since the details were more fitting for Naoto's, and it's this particularly postmodern idea that links emotion with women, while facts and reason and logic is attributed to men. This has always been done in some shape or form throughout the millennia, and it's a purposeful separation in order to paint women's thoughts and opinions as less credible. But it wasn't until the 19th century that it was truly codified via physicians introducing the diagnosable condition hysteria, a condition that essentially boils down to "you're being too emotional." Something that, surprise, surprise, only women could receive because the etymology of it stems from the Greek word for uterus, which is hystera. And Japan did adopt the Western medical model during the Meiji-era reforms of the 1860s onwards. On this note, I find that Naoto serves as this nice parallel to Kanji's arc on societal performances of masculinity. Again, back in my kanji analysis, we explored how this stoic expectation due to the stigmatization of emotions as the realm of women has often led men to only two outcomes. One, don't display any emotion at all, or two, only anger or aggression being acceptable because at least that means you have some fight in you, like a real man. So as we see it play out in Persona 4, Kanji explores the latter of these, while Naoto dives into the former. No visible emotion, always cool and collected, the opposite of hysteria. Okay, to be clear, it's also largely implied that her natural personality is not that expressive anyway, which is a huge catalyst in her struggles since she doesn't present as traditionally feminine, neither via her personality nor her interests. Climbing trees and role-playing as a detective in her youth, and even at the start of her dungeon, the guys in the party comment on how the sci-fi aesthetic is super cool and every man's dream. This brings us to her post-Shadow boss dialogue and rank 7 of her social link. Naoto recalls how she was inept at making friends. She was always alone and an outsider throughout her childhood, and I just can't help but think about how girls are expected to be more nurturing to others and have more outward displays of emotion. We're just raised to be the mediators of our families and the social butterflies slash connectors of our communities. The immediate aftermath of Nanako's death in particular highlights how much Naoto truly doesn't fit this societal mold. Chie, Yukiko, and Rize are all visibly crying. Even the guys, Yosuke and Kanji, are demonstrably furious. And then there's Naoto. It's not like she's not devastated as well, but it doesn't change the fact that she has no visible emotional affect. But this brings us back to the hysteria thing. Hi, Edit here. So I guess to round this all out, binary gender expectations end up hurting everyone in the end. For example, that men must be the primary or even sole providers of the household. It's not surprising, then, that a woman performing well or even better in the workplace, school, or wherever would be viewed with disdain. Something to be sabotaged, even, instead of respected for the hard work it really is. It just seems to me that everyone's self-esteem and mental health would benefit if we maybe not raise boys with this expectation that they must be the family breadwinner or otherwise they are worthless. So interestingly enough, one of my cousins is the stay-at-home dad of his boys, while his wife has gotten to fulfill her career dreams. So I just admire that they found and stuck to a family dynamic that's worked for them despite what others may think. But with that said, we'll be talking about the other side of the coin next, with how girls are raised to eventually take care of all the household chores and errands without any help. Japanese society is still entrenched in Confucian values, where women are socialized to automatically defer to men, their fathers, their brothers, and their partners. These gender norms, when viewed in the context of the household, contextualize as part of Naoto's social link and this genuine worry of career-oriented women. You see, a study published in 2009 found Japan to be an exceptional outlier among other industrialized nations when it came to the share of domestic household chores and labor. So this is like childcare and elder care, on top of cleaning, cooking, and so on. Japanese men, on average, did 2.5 hours of housework a week. This translated to only about 30 minutes a day. Now please take a guess, how much less is this compared to the women? Not 2 times less, not 5 times less, but more than 10 times less than their wives' 27 hours a week. And this is regardless of whether the wife was working full-time, part-time, or was a stay-at-home spouse. So in other words, yes, many women in this study were working full-time, just like their partners, yet we're doing essentially all of the household stuff as well. With that said, I can't help but feel like the reality of this could have influenced Naoto's views on relationships. In rank 3, she discovers a love letter in her locker and has no interest. Like, she doesn't even open it, and is outright dismissive of these romantic entanglements and callow love affairs. I think it's fair to speculate that she gets the feeling getting tied down would come with the expectation that she'd have to give up her career. Plus, I wouldn't be surprised if she was more aware of the trends and actual lived experiences of the overall Japanese population than most of her teen peers may be, simply because her work as a detective directly benefits from knowing how people generally behave and think. So it wouldn't be surprising that she's been exposed to examples of couples and families struggling with this kind of imbalance. Though to be fair, the one time Naoto does bring up her mom, it's pretty much implied she was also a detective, or at the very least working in law enforcement, just like her husband. They died when Naoto was still young though, so she likely doesn't remember nor would have been realistically paying attention to what their dynamic was like at home, if the split in domestic labor was potentially more balanced compared to the average Japanese household. Now, it's not just Japan where the following happens, but women do face greater barriers in their career track/advancements, oftentimes due to a lack of flexible work arrangements that leave mothers at a disadvantage since society normally expects them to take off work to tend to their children's or elderly parents' needs. Repeat after me, everyone. Return to office mandates can go f themselves. Legit though, remote opportunities mean so much to me, for reasons I think are largely overlooked in mainstream conversation around them. As a chronically ill disabled person, I was only able to finish the final courses for my undergrad degree via an online program and remote placement after spending so many years trying out various other adaptations. So for as valid as the criticisms are about what social media is doing to our brains collectively, ultimately I can't help but be beyond grateful that I live in an era that makes connecting with others and working possible for someone like me whose current only constant in scheduling is, ironically, unpredictability due to my health issues. Anyways, it's also just a shame Naoto never got to know her mom, since surely her life experiences, suggestions, and/or advice could have helped her daughter feel less alone and isolated. I cherish the time I was able to spend with my mom before she passed away, and she just continues to influence me to this day. Since I've mentioned this before in a P5 video, but she started her own successful business back in the 80s, which was particularly rare for women in Japan all the way back then. Then when it came to me and school subjects, hobbies, and eventual passions, she always encouraged me to try new things and always ended up supporting whatever I was into, even if it wasn't always properly feminine coded. One of those things is kinda relevant to P4, so bear with me as I lay down some context first. So having played in various music ensembles/orchestras for over 10 years of my life, some of the girls I knew were discouraged by their parents from picking up the more boyish instruments, like any of the low brass, for example, so trombones, euphoniums, or tubas. Vice versa for their brothers too, though. So I feel like anyone who has a fair amount of experience playing in these kinds of ensembles is aware of how gendered certain sections tend to be. Flute being like 95% girls, for example. With all that said, I always found it pretty cool that Ayane plays trombone in Persona 4, especially given how rural communities are stereotypically more traditional/conservative. Yeah, honestly, this game never ceases to amaze me with all its subtle commentary and subversion of gender roles outside of just Kanji and Naoto. So going back to the imbalance of IRL domestic labor, I find it pretty thematically fitting that cooking a variety of different boxed lunches in like a domestic setting is unique to the Persona 4 protag, a dude. Yes, Joker cooks curry and makes coffee, but that's basically your only option in base P5. Persona 3 Reload has added cooking segments, but it isn't the protag's sole effort. He's just basically roped in by friends, a la the bonding events. Meanwhile, Persona 4 is pretty cool with how it emulates real-life cooking without a recipe, since you can get different results for any particular dish via trial and error. I guess what I'm getting at is that Persona 4 feels the most deliberate with cooking itself as an activity, which is an important life skill for anyone, honestly, regardless of gender. Earlier, I covered how Naoto was an interesting parallel to Kanji in performance of masculinity, right? There's an interesting parallel/foil that I can't help but feel is super overlooked. Or at least, I haven't seen it brought up much, and that's between Yukiko and Naoto. So Yukiko is a take on the age-old Yamato Nadeshiko archetype. Long story short, the ideal Japanese woman who is expected to lead with a quiet strength. Yes, she is still expected to be socially adept, but she's also not supposed to broadcast her feelings so openly. Check out my Yukiko analysis if you want to learn more. Anyways, this is the case for her in April prior to her encounter with her shadow. My overall point being, it's a demeanor that's similar on the surface to Naoto's cool and collected personality. It's also interesting how the overall arc of their respective social links essentially play out as opposites of each other. Yukiko feels this external pressure to take over the family business, so she chooses to pick out and try other things of her own volition. She connects with things she's not used to. In contrast, Naoto doesn't feel any external pressure from others to continue the Shirogane line of detectives. She's cognizant of her own genuine love for it. But that spark is rekindled not via her own intrinsic search, but via her grandpa's meddling, or in other words, external forces. And then as Yukiko's social link continues, it's revealed that she's always had a supportive family and staff at the inn. In reality, they never meant for her to feel pressured. They've always been open to her deciding for herself what she'd like to do with her life. So, in other words, the external pressure was more from outside rumors and other people, not from her family. My main point being that Yukiko has always had this supportive circle all along, she just didn't know it. Naoto's social link plays out as the opposite in many ways. It's about finding people who would accept her for who she is. She's never had friends or family, really, what with her parents having died so young. It was just her and her grandpa, and no one else. However, it's her journeying through her social link and reflecting on her newfound friends in Inaba that she can finally say in rank 9 that she's found her people, her, quote, place to stay. I know I've been talking nonstop about how much she wants to make this detective gig work for the entirety of this video so far, but the reality is, it's more complicated than just that. Recall her reaction in July when Yosuke makes a jab at her, that she must be lonely now that the police department has ditched her. You know the shtick. Once her services were no longer needed, she was back to having no friends. But she says as a detective, she's accustomed to that. But as much as she appreciates when she is valued for her work contributions, it still sucks that no one cares about her otherwise. But she's finally found her supportive circle, friends who accept her for who she is. And even though she'll surely be traveling for work later as a detective, she'll have this network of people who are just a phone call away, a wholesome contrast and similarity to Yukiko choosing to stay with her support circle to pursue what she loves, taking over the inn of her own volition. Now, another parallel is how Naoto is a play on the very popular boy detective trope. It fits with the ideal young man any Japanese parents / overall society would hope their children and sons become. Just like how Yamato Nadeshiko is a type of ideal Japanese woman. Usually these boy detectives are portrayed as the responsible and/or brainy kids who excel at academics. And you know, based on my other videos, that this is the #1 priority of Asian youth. And to briefly bring this back to kanji, this trope usually lies opposite of the bancho delinquent who, while popularly depicted in Japanese media, aren't held up as the ideal you'd want to be in real life. And on a similar note to what I've covered in some of the other P4 analyses already, this boy detective trope was especially relevant in the years leading up to, so the conceptualization and development phase of Persona 4. What with the sheer popularity of Death Note at the time, one of the most popular manga and resulting anime adaptations of the entire 2000s, and honestly of all time, with said anime having just finished airing in the summer of 2007. And remember, Persona 4 was made between 2006 and 2008. Which again, definitely plays into P4's big thematic of what's popular on TV and media at the time. I've been meaning to create a shorter one-off analysis for that someday, so please stay tuned. And hey, subscribe and like if you've been enjoying the video so far. Intermission time. Hey guys, I'd like to take a moment to thank all my patrons and channel members for their financial support. Truth is, these behemoth analyses take well over 100 hours each to finish, especially since I'm a one-person show and I really go out of the way in particular to properly source and research. So if you like what I do and have the means to throw some extra dollars my way, any amount, I truly appreciate it. Otherwise, just watching, liking, commenting, and or sharing my videos goes such a long way, and I'm so grateful to all of you viewers. Now back to the video. Please allow me to preface the second half of this video starting with this. So I've seen the following argument a lot over the years, that Naoto's arc was only meant to address toxic gender norms, and not whether or not she's trans. And yeah, I do agree that the main point of her arc is about gender expression and roles. However, this doesn't mean that there weren't some harmful myths and imagery perpetuated about trans people in both the main narrative and social link surrounding her character. Research in social psychology finds that the implicit biases we develop in our childhood and adolescence tend to stick with us for the rest of our adult lives. It's hard to unlearn or even be aware of the stereotypes we've unconsciously developed about certain groups of people, which often just continue to reinforce themselves in our communities unless we actively challenge them. That's why proper portrayals in media are important. There's a lot more to unpack about this regarding Naoto, both positive and negative, especially when considering the cultural context. But before we go any further, I ask that you please just approach the following sections with empathy and an open mind. Alright, let's take a look at a certain developer interview from the Persona 4 Double Jump Strategy Guide. It's about P Studio's thought process behind the conceptualization of these characters, and reads, "Juvenile punks and boy detectives are stereotypes in Japanese anime and comics. But of course, doing straight versions of them would be boring and prevent the players from being pleasantly surprised. So we gave them mental weaknesses completely counter to their appearances." As this pertains to Naoto, my point is that the language in this interview just makes the trans part of her arc sound more like a fun side note than any actual attempt to depict queer characters with proper respect, creating something novel or interesting at the expense of actual trans people. Now, before I continue, I just want to clarify that the problem isn't Naoto ultimately determining for herself she isn't actually trans. Like in the final ranks of her social link, she confirms, "I am a woman and I am a detective." Gender identity is a personal journey. It looks different for everyone, and that's her truth. But I reiterate, it can cause players who identify with the trans presentation of Naoto's dungeon, for example, to internalize negative beliefs about themselves. That something must be inherently wrong or inferior about them. So on that note, one particularly harmful scene is the entire chat Yukiko has with Naoto after we defeat the latter's shadow. Yukiko's top-down approach, and by that I mean how she basically speaks for Naoto herself, sadly mirrors the belittling and even gaslighting many trans folk receive about their own personal lived experience and feelings, especially of the "it's just a phase, you'll grow out of it" flavor.
Hey, you must know already that what you yearn for isn't to become an adult or become a boy.
And Naoto's response.
What I should yearn for, no. What I must strive for isn't to become a man. It's to accept myself for who I really am.
This very much comes across as, "You've been assigned this sex at birth, and you must accept that you were born this way." Hey guys, editing Lady V here. I'd like to introduce some great insight from one of my patrons who directly provides gender-affirming services to many in the trans community.
Hello, my name is Nanda. I'm known in the Patreon as Anger Boda. I am a counselor working in inpatient psychiatry, specialist psychiatry, and gender-affirming care. Basically, when you have an airplane and it needs to take off from the runway, you kind of need a pretty prepared runway. That's the same with any sort of care. You need to be able to feel safe to ask questions, to have doubts, to express them, and have some help in processing all these things to make the best decision that you can make. For young kids who are able to get transition-related care, as long as their families are supportive, they tend to develop just fine as any other kids. We do not know of how the few people who do remain detransitioned do.
Those who remain detransitioned is less than 1% of all trans people, by the way.
But by the data that we have from numerous studies, it's also that those patients do not see their transition as wasted time or a mistake, but something that they're glad to have been able to experience, to be able to come to the conclusion that they have arrived for themselves. And as such, that is basically the data that we have, that trans people know who they are, they know what they want, they know what they need.
So basically, this approach from Yukiko completely dismisses the sheer distress and inner pain that gender dysphoria can cause. Dysphoria being the psychological distress that arises from the incongruence between one's assigned sex at birth and their gender identity. Though it should be noted that not every trans person experiences dysphoria. This brings me to something else that's very trans-coded about Naoto, and that's her embarrassment over her feminine physical attributes, namely her boobs. It's not uncommon for AFAB individuals to experience severe dysphoria over their breasts, and there are a number of instances that give the impression Naoto's uncomfortable or uneasy with them. For one, it seems pretty clear that she binds them or wears a minimizer bra or something along those lines, given how shocked Rize and the other girls are at their size. Then at the culture festival pageant, Naoto refuses to even show up for the bikini section, since that'd obviously be the most physically revealing segment. So the fact her embarrassment is only ever played for laughs or for some kind of shock factor just feels pretty distasteful, given how any exploration of trans identity completely disappears from the main narrative after Naoto's dungeon. Now, before I discuss the most prominent trans legislation in contemporary Japan, I'd like to better clarify certain realms of affirmation. One of these being legal affirmations, like changing gender markers on official government-issued documents. Then there are medical and surgical affirmations, like pubertal suppression or surgical reconstruction, respectively. This last realm is particularly relevant to Japan because they've required mandatory surgical intervention since 2003 in order to have one's gender legally changed in the family registry or any other official government document. As for how surgical reconstruction is described in Naoto's dungeon, it's unfortunately portrayed as this weird, taboo, and/or kinky thing, when in reality it's a very serious decision that can be life-changing in the best possible way for many trans people. Now, something of note about Japan is that people are generally accepting of trans folk who do go through gender-affirming procedures to have their outer appearance and biological attributes align with their gender identity. This stems in large part from the Confucian values I mentioned earlier in the video, that as long as someone is conforming to their proper role in society, it doesn't really matter what they're doing otherwise. So, in other words, if a trans man goes through the medical procedures and dresses, acts, and sounds like a typical man, then society will be much more approving, and vice versa with trans women. I have a bit more to say in relation to this later. There's this pretty interesting Heian period classic called Torikaebaya Monogatari, which features two siblings who can best be interpreted as a trans man and trans woman respectively. But back to the 2003 legislative bill, it's referred to as the GID Special Cases Act. GID standing for Gender Identity Disorder, an outdated diagnosis that has since been replaced by gender dysphoria, as we mentioned earlier. This law ultimately introduced some of the most restrictive and discriminatory conditions that don't align with best medical practices as outlined by the WHO, though. Such discrimination includes being presently unmarried, having no underage children at the time, and undergoing legit sterilization. Even the requirement to undergo reconstruction surgery simply for legal recognition and other rights such as marriage amounts to coercion. And even for those who are willing to undergo surgery and or genuinely want it for themselves, oftentimes it's not even affordable. Not only because of the initial costs, but also because of all the future maintenance. And as someone who has a chronic illness, chronic pain, and just long-term health issues of my own due to a neurological condition, I know how fragile your body can get, to the point where any surgery in general poses a greater risk. Also, while I was a patient in a spinal cord rehab unit, my roommate's story was legit really sad. She was around 50 years old and a very accomplished professional chef with her own restaurants, but she was landed there because of a botched routine procedure which caused sepsis in her spinal cord, resulting in a complete SCI and paraplegia for her. Now, my intention with sharing this isn't to scare people away from surgery. It's just that, though these kinds of major risks are usually rare, they can still happen, so it's not surprising to me why many people would want to avoid invasive procedures like this if they can help it. But in general, all these medical requirements amount to cruel treatment to people who just want to experience legal and or social affirmations without inviting additional risk to their health. As for Naoto's social link, it also contains some hurtful messaging. The romance flag in particular. So this dialogue option, "I'm glad you're a girl," stands in such stark juxtaposition to the actually supportive answer, and the one that wins more points from Naoto herself. "Your gender doesn't matter." Surely it's hurtful to see one of the only times a character that trans players may identify with be essentially told via the game that they are unattractive and or undeserving of romance unless they adhere to their biological sex. The sad icing on the cake is that this is the one and only romance flag of Naoto's route too. But with all of this covered, given the overwhelming lack of education and resources on these issues in Japan, which I'll go over in more detail in a later section, I'm wary of labeling all the mishandling in P4 as deliberately malicious by the staff. However, The onus of due diligence and proper research on a marginalized identity, especially when basing such a large aspect of Naoto around it, was on them. Again, I've said this in the kanji video as well, but just because they didn't intend these various scenes to be transphobic doesn't mean these depictions weren't that. So let's talk about this very interesting Heian era story, the Torikaebaya Monogatari. Queer scholars like Gregory Plugfelder writes that gender identity within this tale notably manifests itself from childhood and reflects the disposition of the individual characters in expression and interests. Furthermore, the father laments that he can't change the sexes of his children, trading female and male bodies to match their personalities, though neither of the parents consider the possibility of altering their kid's gender. So in other words, interestingly, quite trans-affirming. Now, unfortunately, there does come a point where the two siblings switch genders, and the circumstances that cause it are pretty sad and outside of their control. Oh, I should make it clear, by the way, I have not read the text of Torikaebaya myself, so I'm paraphrasing / sharing mostly Plugfelder and Friedelin's summary of the events. So, long story short, Himegimi has been living as a male courtesan, or a trans man, and Wakagimi as a lady of the court, a trans woman. But Himegimi's true nature is eventually discovered by his best fellow courtesan friend. She is raped and is forced to become a woman again out of necessity when she becomes pregnant. She ends up donning female garb and drinks this hair-growing potion. And in turn, Wakagimi makes the decision to leave the seclusion of the palace and become a man again in order to search for his disappeared sibling. And to make it clear, since Himegimi was a male courtesan all the while before, it'd be like if that person just up and vanished one day. Anyway, this is the main gist of the story you need to know for the purpose of this video, but I highly recommend you read the full journal I've linked below since the entire analysis is really fascinating. Another notable thing about this tale is that gender is much more malleable and performative than the traditional Western idea that binds it closely to biological sex. Plugfelder also reflects on the Buddhist influences on this kind of storytelling, where both the ordinary and the strange, so in other words, normative and non-normative behavior, are more closely knit than Judeo-Christianity's more binary belief on what constitutes good or bad. Now, I'm not an expert on Confucian and Buddhist influences on culture by any means, as much as I love to talk about it, but I can't help but posit that it's mostly the Confucian societal expectations that have this tale end the way it does, with both Himegimi and Wakagimi continuing to serve what's essentially their obligations as their biological sex, since it's only Confucian teachings, as opposed to Buddhist or Shinto, that primarily concerns itself with social order. And interestingly enough, there's a fair number of Heian-era works, and particularly pre-Meiji times, that contain an assortment of the following explorative pairings within characters, so to speak, of either unambiguous sex and gender, unambiguous sex and ambiguous gender, or ambiguous sex and unambiguous gender. Such things that are definitely non-normative by contemporary Japanese standards, which leads me to the Meiji-era reforms. Gender binaries always intensify in the lead up to more nationalist rhetoric across civilizations, which is exactly what happened during the Meiji Restoration and the eventual imperialist expansion of Japan. I discussed the role in clothing and hairstyles of pre-Meiji times in way more detail in the kanji video, but to sum up the entire point of the Kagema topic from then, they were a natural part of the Japanese conscience prior to Meiji, but after the introduction of Western medical practices, the acceptance of more androgynous appearances began to erode. Just think about it. Both men and women wore yukata and kimono for millennia, which for us Westerners can be boiled down to just dresses or long skirts. But the Meiji government mandated that all men must wear pants, as well as adopt the mid-length haircut, regardless of age. Those who didn't were fined under a law introduced in 1873. The full adoption of the Western biomedical model also set the stage for more transphobic and also homophobic views of the latter 20th century onwards. Sure, it definitely had many positive effects on public health outcomes, no denying that, but in the early 1900s, Western psychology and sexology began to be translated and introduced to Japanese academia, and with it came the idea that homosexuality was unnatural and even a disease, and gender identities were conflated with sexual orientation at the time. But with all of this covered, let's return to the topic of Naoto, Persona 4, and 21st century Japan's views of LGBTQ+ issues. The following isn't meant to excuse this transphobic lens or behavior, but to help explain why things may have turned out the way they did in Persona 4. So I'd like you to recall that implicit bias thing I mentioned earlier. Just as much as we are a product of our own nature, we are also a product of our environment. The behaviors and thoughts of our community are what becomes normal to us. Now in general, this section will contain quite a bit of what I've already covered in the kanji video, but since kanji and Naoto's arc mishaps focus on different things, please stick with me, I'll be going over some new stuff here. So in 2016, so not that long ago and definitely already after P4's release, the Human Rights Watch published a substantial report on just how extensive anti-LGBT culture was for students. The survey found that 86% of respondents had heard anti-LGBT insults from both teachers and classmates within that most recent academic year. A school counselor shares how long-lasting and devastating this rhetoric is to his queer students. But it's not just what these kids hear that's so harmful, but also the complete lack of resources and objective information on the subject. He says that students come in to see him without having any kind of vocabulary to describe themselves, their gender identity or sexual orientation, and oftentimes what info there is available is negative. A student who identifies as X-gender, or essentially non-binary to Westerners, remembers that in their health textbook, there was only a reference to homosexuality, and a negative one at that, claiming it increases risk of HIV. It's common for teachers to label gender non-conforming kids as selfish and arrogant, and Kenji D, a transgender student, recalls being told at age 15 by a school nurse and a group of teachers that his feelings were temporary and he'd grow out of it. Now gee, it's not like we've heard that one somewhere before, right?
What I should yearn for, no. What I must strive for isn't to become a man. It's to accept myself for who I really am.
Furthermore, most Japanese schools are still very binary when it comes to school uniforms. Pants for boys, skirts for girls. Takeshi O, a trans man, remembers growing to dread every single morning of junior high since it meant having to put a skirt on. Similarly, Akemi N says his high school administrators required him to show a certificate of GID in order to change his uniform, but even after he acquired one and presented it to them, they denied his request on the grounds there was no precedent for them to follow. You can read the rest of the report along with all my other journals and sources with the links in the description. With all this said, in a 2018 Japanese survey, nearly 84% of respondents said they weren't aware of anyone who identified as queer in their community. Now, I can't be certain about this, but I can only imagine these numbers being even lower in 2009 when Persona 4 first came out. The 2010s was a big boom in advocacy for the Japanese LGBT+ community thanks to the rise in social media and internet usage. Meanwhile, a 2022 Pew Research poll done in the US found that 44% of Americans did personally know someone who was specifically trans. So clearly, the lived experiences are very different in this regard. Now, notably, the concepts of gender identity and sexual orientation are determined by the self. And by determined, I don't mean that in a dismissive way like, it's just a choice or preference. I mean from the standpoint of how it's on the person in question to conclude for themselves, and a contrast to gender roles and norms that are determined by society. So given Japan's collectivist culture and Confucian heritage where group harmony is prioritized over the individual, it makes a ton of sense to me why a game written by Japanese people might primarily focus on and handle the exploration of gender norms and resulting expression, so things dictated by society, so much better than concepts that have more to do with the individual's sense of self. Back in my Persona polls and silent protags video, I went over how East Asians have a fundamentally different concept of the self in the first place compared to Western individualistic nations. Though this isn't true of all, of course, since no one group of people is a monolith. But the gist of it is that research finds that the Eastern concept of self doesn't really exist separate from other people, but is instead interdependent on the surrounding community. They felt most fulfilled when others and themselves acknowledged and could see their social roles, status, and relationships. Anyway, my main points here were to highlight the environment these folks are raised in, including Atlus staff, and how these transphobic thoughts and behavior are largely learned, internalized, and perpetuated, unfortunately. So in this final section, I'd like to share some hopeful trends in Japanese trans advocacy of recent years, starting with this. Remember all those requirements stipulated by the GID Act from 2003? Well, one of those, the compulsory sterilization, was ruled unconstitutional by the Japanese Supreme Court in October 2022. The Diet still needs to debate and amend the rest of the bill, so there's still plenty of work to be done, but it's progress nevertheless. As for the surgical component, the Hiroshima High Court approved a legal gender change for a trans woman without requiring her to go through a procedure just this past July. Basically, they determined that her hormonal therapy was sufficient. This case is somewhat connected to that landmark Supreme Court decision I just mentioned. At the time, they sent this trans woman's case back to the High Court, asking them to re-examine the gender-affirming surgery part. So once again, it looks like it'll be up to the Supreme Court to make their ruling now that the Hiroshima High Court has made its own. There's also a growing, albeit still small, number of trans candidates running for and being elected to local public office. In fact, Tomoya Hosoda became the first trans man to ever be elected to public office in 2017. As for trans women, Ayako Fuchigami was elected to the Hokkaido Legislative Assembly in 2019. And referring back to that Human Rights Watch report, the one on how the resources on LGBT plus concepts were either negative or non-existent, well, this isn't any kind of binding change to the curriculum, but this huge survey from 2020 found that nearly 90% of the public interviewed generally or firmly believed queer info should be taught in schools. And just overall, this was quite the encouraging poll for Japan's LGBT plus future. As for Atlus itself, I brought up already existing changes as well as a number of hopefuls back in the kanji video from, oh my god, it's from October of last year. I'm so sorry guys, this one took so long, but here it is, finally. But, since then, Persona 3 Reload has officially launched and notably removed the transphobic content from the Yakushima beach scene. Plus, I think it's especially important to note that Studio Zero's fantastic metaphor Refantasio, so in other words, Katsura Hashino and the old guard of Persona development, did not contain any anti-LGBT plus jokes or content, which definitely shows growth given the kind of stuff found in their previous projects, so that's awesome to see. To finally circle back to Naoto and wrap this up, I think about where Japan, and especially a rural town like Inaba, was back in 2008 since, Persona 4 was written by Japanese people for a Japanese audience. I don't think the negative aspects of Naoto's arc should completely invalidate the success where it exists. The commentary on the misogyny, implicit biases, and barriers women face in the workforce, especially in male-dominated sectors, as well as a challenge to traditional views of gender expression and what it means to be feminine in a society that values strict gender role conformity. And though there were unfortunate trans stereotypes perpetuated at times in Naoto's arc, she herself is such a likable character who has grounded real-world problems, which has definitely endeared her to so many players, some who have curiously gone on to educate themselves further on gender and trans issues because of her. I can really identify with the parts of Naoto that struggle to be taken seriously in a male-dominated space, especially since I took an interest in politics and macro-level issues in my late adolescence in high school onwards to college. You see, I was double majoring in international affairs, so just think of it as poli-sci, and social work, though my personal interest in the discipline leaned towards wider community and macro-scale issues. And long story short, prior to my debilitating health conditions, I was entrusted with many leadership roles in student government, MUN, or Model United Nations, and community engagement activities on campus and our neighboring cities. Now, unfortunately, there were and still always will be people who don't believe women belong in these spaces and or should hold leadership positions, which is what makes witnessing Naoto's arc so cathartic. But anyways, I'm aware my audience is mostly men, but to all the fellow women in my audience, I'd especially love to hear what you thought of Naoto's struggle. And of course, trans folk and or gender non-conforming, non-binary, and so on people, I'd love to hear from you too and what you think about this character, especially if you were coming of age in the 2008-ish times. Please let me know in the comments. But yeah, so I cut a few sections from this video because this was taking way too long to finish, and some of these other ideas could just be videos of their own. Anyway, please check out all my other persona analyses and like, comment, subscribe, all that stuff helps with the YouTube algo. Find me on my other socials, and finally I'd like to thank all my patrons and channel members, especially my Special Fusion supporters, Big Clingy, Sam Bezjak, Francesco Santoyo Rego, and Meownalin, Malcolm Lowry, Peter Shepard, Andy, Undercloak421, Jimmy Tapiz, Frank Sasaki, and Phoenix Black.